The Dead Space remake is finally here, and you know what? It's really good. Like, it's a Resident Evil 2 remake level of quality. The lighting and the sound design is just something you have to experience for yourself if you're a fan of the series. Like, I actually can't say enough about how pleasantly I was surprised with this game. Besides a few nitpicks here and there, the only problem, and I'm using that word pretty loosely here, I had was with frame rates. And actually one game crashed now that I think about it. But nothing I imagine that can't be patched up. That being said, it was nothing that took away from my overall game experience. The icing on this fleshy little Dead Space cake for me is its impossible achievement, Untouchable. Now, it's not literally impossible, that's just what they call the difficulty you have to clear to get this achievement. And it's kind of a hybrid of the hardest modes throughout Dead Space 1 to 3. Dead Space 1, you have impossible difficulty, which is just an extra hard mode and nothing else. Dead Space 2 has hardcore mode, where you get 3 saves across the entire game. Dead Space 3 also had hardcore mode, but instead of limited saves, you had permadeath. If you died, it wiped your save and sent you back to the start of the game. Good thing Dead Space 3 didn't also have a really janky climbing mechanic with insta-kills, because that probably would make it really stressful to play. By the way, I've done videos on all those achievements. Unfortunately, YouTube thinks that they're too violent or something, so they all got age restricted. I'll link them in the description, but you can also just find them on my channel if you're interested. Okay, so the Dead Space remake kind of combines all of these for its own impossible mode, and here's how it works. Impossible is just as hard as the hard difficulty in terms of damage taken and given. You can save as many times as you want, but you get exactly 1 save slot. If you die, the run is over and you have to start from scratch if you want to give it another go. If you win, besides getting the Untouchable achievement, you get a couple unlockables. On top of all of that, I decided to throw in one extra challenge for this run, the One Gun achievement, which you get for finishing the Dead Space remake only using the plasma cutter. Despite every gun in the remake being pretty good now, especially the flamethrower, the plasma cutter is still all we really need. So with all the preamble finally out of the way, let's jump into the Dead Space remake's Untouchable achievement. Chapter 1 is mostly a tutorial. You gotta let baby Isaac take his first steps and whatnot. There's not a whole lot to say about the start of this game, so this gives me a quick chance to talk about the story progression. The remake follows the original story beats super faithfully throughout the entire game, with a lot more of it being fleshed out. If you know Dead Space 1, you know like 90% of the remake. That being said, I'll still be avoiding the majority of the new story stuff in this video. Anyways, we pretty much immediately get the stasis module, and it's just as good as ever. These doors and pretty much any other environmental hazard in the game put a deep primal fear in my heart, so I try to be excessively safe around them. We run into the first workbench right away as well, and upgrading is a smidge different now. So in Dead Space 1 and 2, there used to be empty slots that you needed to use power nodes on to reach upgrades. That's not the case in the remake. Every node has an upgrade associated with it, no matter what you're juicing up. The only thing stopping you from upgrading something, besides having enough power nodes on hand, are either a higher tier suit or finding upgrade parts for your guns around the Ishimura that further fill out the upgrade trees. That being said, I still like to rush health and damage upgrades. Speaking of power nodes, besides buying them, you can find them pretty much anywhere, and you no longer need them to open locked doors. Instead, the Dead Space remake added a security clearance system, and your security access gets upgraded progressively throughout the game. So if you see a locked door or locker, it's usually worth it to come back later when you're able to open it. At least that's what I did. It's not really hard to get around the Ishimura either, since the tram acts as a fast travel of sorts now. And just to quickly touch on stores, I pretty much only bought ammo, health, and power nodes. But like I just said, you can find power nodes everywhere, so I stopped grabbing them about halfway through the game because I was caught up on upgrades at that point. Also, they brought the suit ups back. I did end up wearing the classic suit skin for a good chunk of this run. It was purely cosmetic though, so don't worry. At the very end of the chapter, we get the Kinesis module, and you'll be happy to hear that Kinesis is insanely strong in this game. Launching poles and pipes tends to nuke most necromorphs in a single shot, just as nature intended. Chapter 2, we're in medical, and immediately given the chance to pick up the pulse rifle. You don't buy guns in the Dead Space remake, you just take them from dead people most of the time. So I'm not really sure if you're allowed to pick up new guns and immediately store them, or if that voids the One Gun achievement, so I avoided them like the plague. We get our first 0G section of the game here, and I'm happy to report that I don't hate it. It's just an updated version of the Dead Space 2 and 3 system. Medical is where the game will start pulling a lot of quarantines on you, which is something we'll be seeing throughout the entire game. Long story short, all the doors close on you, there's flashing lights, necromorphs popping through vents, the works. It'll end when all the necromorphs in the room are dead. But on the bright side, there's usually a lot of stuff to kinesis in these situations, so have at her. Lurkers start showing up in medical as well, and they're the same as always. Maybe a little harder to see when you're spinning around in a flesh fight, but still squishy enough not to matter when they're the only thing attacking you. And right after the lurkers, we get infectors. The age-old rule of stomping every body you see will usually save you from any stress these guys cause, but I'm not allowed to show that on YouTube anymore, so sorry. Chapter 3 has us in engineering for engine-related problems. I should mention, though, that there's a room in here right by where we don't pick up the Ripper that's part of a side quest that runs almost the entirety of the game. You can actually start the quest back in medical, and it's kind of hard to miss, but I'm pretty certain you can start it here too. We don't do it in this run though, because it involves a lot of backtracking and running around, and I'm in the mindset that the less of that we do, the better. So we're off on a little tram ride to fuel up the Ishimura's engines, and it's pretty chill, all things considered. The devs of the remake did an insanely good job making all these areas look damn near identical to their counterparts in the original game, and even the ones that are changed up a bit are still usually super recognizable. One decontamination shower filled with necromorphs later, and we're at the centrifuge. Basically, we zip around in 0G to get this thing turned back on, and then we gotta try to not get crushed by it. You pretty much have just enough time to run from safe spot to safe spot before it hits you. You also super don't want to psych yourself out because your air tank capacity isn't exactly long. Don't get got by the slasher on the tracks either. Not too shortly after that, we get maybe the most cursed room in the game.
Why did they make this room so fucking loud? Guys, is this an okay room to AFK in? I could go make the coffee right now.
It's so loud. I don't remember this room in the original. Why would they do this? The absolute worst enemy in the game is here now. The swarmers. Once these little chicken nugget looking guys get on you, you can't do anything until you shake them off. They don't do as near as much damage as they did in the original, but they are 100% more annoying here. At least without the flamethrower or force gun. Really, they're just a good reason to make sure that you shoot the pregnants in the legs. And yes, that's what these big guys are still called. But if you do have to deal with swarmers, explosive barrels or fire extinguishers are a good option. The chapter wraps up with a big ol' fight in one of the engine rooms. There's a lot of stuff to throw here, and that's what I'd recommend you do. Chapter 4 has the first brute of the game, and they're honestly incredibly easy to deal with. First you stasis, then you shoot the tops of the shoulders, you'll know you're hitting the weak spot if it squirts, and that's it.
Hazardous anomaly detected. Quarantine activated.
Now we're doing some more ship chores, and instead of dodging anti-gravity panels like in the original, it's only electricity now. My chat tells me that these aren't insta-kills, but I wasn't about to test it out. Brute number 2 is here and right next to a stasis recharge, so you can imagine how this went. All the space chores we've done lead us to a turret section, kind of. We're supposed to calibrate these guns to shoot down asteroids, and it's not like a traditional turret section, so I guess we're just gonna give this one a pass. Don't get hit by space rocks, okay? Chapter 5 does 2 things. The first is reintroduce us to the Guardians, and I never got close enough to one of these guys to see if they still insta-kill us. Feel free to try it for yourself, though. The second thing is that we meet the Hunter, and he's pretty huntery, I guess. But it's the same old song and dance with him. Cut his legs off, stasis, then book it before he regenerates. We're supposed to get to the other side of medical to lift a lockdown, and there are some rooms where he drops in with a bunch of other necromorphs. But nothing is really stopping us from ignoring everything and running. As soon as we lift the lockdown, toxic gas starts getting pumped in, and we have to run back across half the medical wing to the lobby to shut the gas off. There's a lot of running back and forth in this chapter. If you give her straight to the lobby and stasis everything in your way, you should be fine. Watch out for the chicken nuggets though. So you'd think there's no more running across medical, right? Well, we gotta do it one more time. Back to where the Hunter busts out of his tank because it brings us to cryogenics, where we need to grab some liquid nitrogen. But this actually turns into a very short-lived boss fight where we Lieutenant Dan the Hunter into being frozen. Chapter Chapter 6 has a couple of big fights in it, but it's mostly going through various hazards in hydroponics and forcing the Weezers to take their puffers. And beyond fighting the urge to make a bunch of jokes about the band Weezer, nothing here was really tough. I was blowing through most fights with a lot of plasma cutting and a lot of kinesising. The only other thing to mention is that exploders start showing up in this chapter as well. But the real star of this chapter is the Leviathan, back in all of its glory. So the first thing you want to do in this fight is grab all the loot you can floating around here, because the second thing we're going to do is shoot the Leviathan a lot. There's not really a whole bunch to this fight besides strafing a little bit and hitting its dangly bits. When it's almost dead, it'll spray out some poisonous gas, but just keep on shooting. When it's finally dead, it gets slurped out into space, potentially with some of the items that are still floating around, so that's why you want to grab those immediately. Chapter 7 is a lovely little walk across the mining deck. It's mostly space chores again, like throwing rocks into a tractor beam, or finding an SOS beacon that's locked up, attaching it to an asteroid, and then launching it into space. I kind of hated this part in the original because I'd always find a way to get hit by the things holding the asteroid in place, but the new zero-G system kind of stopped me from having any problems here at all. The only other thing is that the hunter shows up, freshly thawed, and once we do launch the asteroid, we get locked into a room with him. But he still doesn't really know how to hunt without legs. Chapter 8 starts with a quarantine shootout in the bridge with a bunch of exploders and a few other necromorphs in the mix. Exploders take like 2 shots to the sack with the cutter to explode, so as long as those are managed, it's pretty chill. We're on our way to fix the comms array, and I'll be honest. On my first playthrough of this game before I attempted this run, I was stuck here for like 30 minutes. I tend to have a problem overthinking a lot of puzzles in most games, but I was happy to hear that other pals who played this did the exact same thing I did. You essentially just need to run one of 2 power lines to one of 3 connecting spots in the middle of the array. I initially thought I had to find a way to connect them all. Anyways, as soon as we activate the array, it just doesn't work. So we gotta head out into space to find out what's up. We just have to 1v1 Slenderman first. So it turns out that the Leviathan isn't dead, and we gotta blast it off the Ishimura. This fight might be a little tougher than the first, but not by much. It's mostly keeping an eye on your oxygen and blasting away at the turrets. The Leviathan will shoot up proximity mine kidney stones after the first 2 weak spots are destroyed, and that might be the most dangerous part of this fight. I mean, they're not that bad to navigate, but you also don't want to get slapped around during this part. Uh-oh. It'll destroy the final turret after you open up its last weak spot, but that's too little too late for the big guy.
Warning. ATS cannon destroyed.
There we go. I probably could have sped that up by shooting both guns at the same time earlier, but Chapter 9 has us board the Valor, and this is a pretty quick chapter as well. Just a few things to talk about. The first thing is that my favorite enemies in Dead Space 1 are here, the Twitchers. These guys are just really cool. So in this game, if you shoot the stasis packs on their chest, they explode in an AoE and makes it really easy to crowd control anything around them. Otherwise, they're super fast and super aggressive. So the next thing on the Valor is what I think could be the most stressful room in this game. There's an armory with a lot of live ammo just kicking around. Now, I'm not sure if a stray shot from any of the weapons in the game can set them off, but I know for sure that one of the 2 exploders in this room can if you shoot them in the sack, which is an instant game over. So being plasma cutter only, I had the damage over time upgrade that does a little bit of burning to the necromorphs, and also had zero idea if this would set their sacks off. I was hesitant to try kinesis as well because I was afraid to fire off a stray and clip their sacks, but it turned out all the stress was for nothing because the plasma cutter did the job. Anticlimactic, I know. Okay, one down. One down, chat. These guys are chumps. The shooting range makes a comeback as well, but it's a little different than in the original.
Caution, live fire exercise.
After that, the only thing that really goes on here is a shootout in the cargo hold of the Valor. It's pretty easy to get the necromorphs bottlenecked at this one electrical hazard, and there's a lot of stuff to throw in here, so it's really no sweat. After we get the core of the ship, we just gotta run straight out. Though I am kind of curious if you stand around if you blow up with the ship. In Chapter 10, we're trying to get access to an executive shuttle on the crew deck and power it with the Valor's core. This is a really cool chapter to play because there's a lot of expanded story stuff going on that you can find by exploring the crew deck, but nothing we're going to cover in this run. So even with all that story stuff going on, the best part of this chapter is clearly Zero-G basketball. It's really easy and it gets you a lot of loot. Beyond that, we're essentially running all around the place cleaning up tentacles while the hunter chases us. At this point in the run, I was fully juiced up and didn't really have a problem with any combat encounter here. Although there is a fight that takes place by the marker and it makes the necromorphs glow all red and stuff, and I have no idea if this is purely cosmetic or if it makes them stronger. The chapter ends after one last fight against the hunter. It's really easy. You take away his knees, stasis him, then test fire the shuttle engines. Honestly, there's not a whole lot to say about Chapter 11. It's mostly about loading up the marker onto the shuttle, and I guess we can point out the difference between this part of the remake versus the OG. You no longer have to kinesis around the marker on rails anymore. It moves automatically and you just have to clear its path. So essentially this chapter is just killing necromorphs and pressing buttons until the marker's loaded onto the shuttle. After a whole bunch of story stuff, you get the choice to leave the Ishimura for good or wrap up any unfinished business. I immediately left because there was nothing that the side quests could offer me that I really needed at this point. Chapter 12 is the end of the game, and just like the original, it's mostly non-stop combat. The marker is luckily on tracks here still, so we're just worried about mowing down necromorphs and pressing the odd button here or there. There's really not a lot to say about this part either, because it's just muscle memory at this point. Shoot legs, kinesis, stasis, etc, etc. I mean, there's a part with double guardians, but they're not really a threat. Though there is this one part with the final environmental hazard in the game. So essentially you reroute power down in this area and have to fly straight out. There are 3 sets of fans that you have to zero-G through, or so I thought. Well, it turns out that if you don't clear the tentacles in this area, they actually hold all the fans still and become a non-problem. I didn't actually realize this until I passed through the first set of fans, so the more you know. Eventually we get the marker to where it needs to be, a bunch of cool story stuff happens, and then we're at the final boss. Right before we go visit the hive mind though, there's a final store and bench if you need anything. I had a lot of money at this point, so I just spent everything on health and ammo, just in case, you know? The hive mind is fairly similar to its fight in the original game. You shoot the dangly bits while he tries to give you the tentacle tickle. Once you destroy the first danglies, he opens up his chesticles and starts squirting at you. All of its attacks are pretty well telegraphed, so it really just boils down to sidestepping it once it commits to an attack. This was my second time ever fighting this thing. The first obviously being on my initial playthrough, and I basically had its attacks down to a T because they're that straightforward. The worst part is when it picks you up upside down and you gotta blast its last bit. Beyond that, pretty easy fight. I think that's it! I think that's it. I was really afraid I was gonna miss all those shots. I don't know how many shakes you get before it. Oh, it went in for one last squirt. And that's the Dead Space Remake's Untouchable and One Gun achievement. Here's what we unlocked. I love this game, and I think it's really good, but I don't think it's particularly hard. The only death I've taken in this game was from blowing up the Valor's nuke room on my first run before I even tackled impossible mode. Beyond that, I was mostly worried about getting Isaac's dumpy caught in a door or a fan. So yeah, this achievement is obviously pretty far from being impossible. I'm super excited to see if they carry on with a remake of Dead Space 2, and if it does happen, I'm sure we'll be seeing the hardcore run making a return in a similar fashion. As always, you can catch me doing these runs live over at twitch.tv/anxiety. Thanks for watching.